Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisandra Alexander, and I work for the Pennsylvania Department of Education. I have been with migrants for 18 years, in education over 20 years now. And I have been with iSOSY since it started about, I think, 15, 16 years ago, and it was just OSY. I want to welcome all of you to this workshop. We are going to talk about book studies. The name of the workshop is Cultivating Professional Growth and Personal Wellness Through Book Studies. I am joined by Becca and Misha, and also our consultant. If Becca and Misha can introduce themselves.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Becca. I am with the Vermont Migrant Education Program, and I've been working with migrant programming for 4 years now. And I'm so excited to chat with you all today.
Isha Patrick, and I'm with the Alabama Migrant Education Program. I've been in education for about 28 years, and I am 2.5 years with solely focusing on the migrant population.
And I'm Laura Thomas. I work with iSOSY as a consultant regarding mental health and personal wellness.
And she'll be our chat master.
You bet.
All right, so here are names again. iSOSY covered, I believe, 18 states, and you can see those there. So we all belong to a work group called the Personal Wellness Work Group. And what is personal wellness? Well, this group started with talking about mental health. I don't know if you remember, we had all of those mental health lessons that are still being used, I know, at least in my state. But we thought there is more to this topic than just the mental health aspect. So we decided to have a more inclusive term that includes both the mind and body. So that's why we decided to call it personal wellness. And we have a training package. We have 9 modules that are available. They all have the slide deck, presenter notes, facilitator guides, and activities. If you were with us yesterday, we discussed the responsible decision making in collaboration with Impact. So how do you find this great resource? Well, you go to the OSY Migrant website, and then you can just, under practitioner, you can click on personal wellness. And there's a lot of resources here. If you were here early, you learned about the history and role of ACEs that was done by Jessica. So we have a lot of resources there, but if you we have a QR code here. If you want to go to that page and kind of take a look, that's good. And of course, the PowerPoint will be available after the workshop. Well, it's actually in the Google Drive.
All right. So now that we've talked a little bit about what personal wellness is, we're going to talk about what it means to explore it within a book study. So why should we be using book studies as professionals? While a lot of us like to read for pleasure, and probably a lot of us would rather be watching TV shows, there are professional reasons why reading a wide variety of books regularly can improve how we are professionally. Some examples are that reading can give us a better vocabulary for talking about what we're seeing day to day in the field. It can spark our creativity and even reduce stress and foster empathy. It's also known to increase intelligence and build perseverance. All right, so a few more benefits of book studies include some much needed moments for self-reflection. and moments to intentionally bring ourselves into the work that we're doing and see how it's impacting us and we're impacting others. It's an opportunity to exchange ideas with coworkers and other folks in the field. And it gives a little bit of time for us to think critically about our work and work to improve it.
So this group deals a lot with trauma. So we wanted to give you kind of like a background, a quick two slide background on trauma. So it can be an event, can be just one thing. And it's experienced by an individual. So like, I like to give the example, I come from a family of 5 kids. Some things affected me differently than they did my other siblings, and we lived the same situations. So it's an event experienced by an individual, and it has lasting adverse effects. So it has like some effects on your well-being and your functioning in mental, physical, social, or emotional well-being. So what are those long-term impacts? Well, people that have a score of 4 or more that have a lot of these adversity events, which include being neglected, being sexually abused, coming from a broken home, things like that, can actually affect you later in life. So from health itself, more likely to have problems with mental health issues later in life, also more likelihood of things that can put you at risk, such as sexual promiscuity, more drug and alcohol use. So it has a lasting effect not only for ourselves, but also for our community as a whole.
All right. So we really hope to make our programming trauma informed. But what does that mean? Trauma informed programming, it can be really easy to see it as a checklist, but the reality is it's a journey. And our goal is not to fix people, because there's no magical program that's going to be doing that. Instead, our intention is to support people in becoming successful. A new way to kind of reframe how we're thinking about this is often we have the tendency to hyper focus on the need to identify students who have experienced trauma, while we're actually losing sight of the overarching fact that trauma-informed practices really do work for all students. And if we adopt this mindset, it reduces the need to identify specific students. Something that is also really important to think about while talking about trauma-informed programming is trauma-informed self-reflection. While we're often focusing on how our students' traumatic histories impact how they react to situations both inside and outside the classroom, it's just as important to explore how our own personal trauma and lived experiences may impact how we interact with students and coworkers. I think often we forget that these interactions are two-sided. We're not a blank slate. And no matter how hard we try to be, we are also entering these conversations with our own complex histories. And it's a disservice to our students and colleagues to not reflect on what we are bringing with us. Book studies allow for the space to do personal reflection of our own lived experiences that we are bringing into this work.
The book that we selected for our book study was What Happened to You? A Conversation of Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. It's by Dr. Bruce Perry. And you know, if you invite Oprah, you're going to be guaranteed a bestseller. But Dr. Perry has the background in his own right. He is the leader of the Neurosequential Network, and he's an adjunct professor at Northwestern University, as well as an adjunct professor at La Trobe University in Australia. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Perry has been an active teacher, researcher, and clinician in children's mental health and the neuroscience. And what we discovered by reading this book, how all of this connects, and that one isolated event may not be an isolated event once we have all our system involved. Our book study materials, we met 3 times. We had 2 virtual meetings, and then we ended up with 1 full meeting. If you look at the QR code, it outlines some of the study questions that we used. It was very guided reading. When we didn't just send everyone off and say, okay, read the first third, the second third, and the last third. We asked everyone to download the guided questions. So when we came and had our book talk, that you didn't feel like you were out there alone. You were able to participate in the guided discussion because of the guided reading that we provided. So why did we select What Happened to You? A lot of times when we're dealing with our children, as well as ourselves, we focus on the behavior of what is going on with that child. And we'll say, well, why did you do this? Why did you do that? We never truly understand that a long amount or persistent trauma can change the way that our bodies, we have that emotional response. But not only that, but it can change the way we start thinking and react, because we tend to react then think. Well, in this book study, it analyzes why does this happen and what can we do to change that path? Because our neurons and our neurological path is changed when we are constantly bombarded with some type of trauma. And in migrant education, you have to think about the trauma that we don't necessarily think to be trauma, of moving every so many months for basic survival, for the lack of housing, for the lack of work, that being played upon not only a family, but children, and how that can rewire their brain. And we have some responses, or emotional responses, or physical responses, that not necessarily we don't understand as service providers and recruiters. But this book kind of delve into that, and how not only do we need to start looking at our children and thinking about our children's reactions, but kind of guiding us through different types of skills that we can use when we're working with our families. A strong thing that I gathered from the book, it made me look at myself and how some of my past traumas, and how I have to teach myself how to regulate so that I can have desirable outcomes when I'm reacting to certain situations. Next slide. Now, the major concepts of the book: when people experience traumatizing events, they are both emotional and biological responses. Well, let's think about this. When our first natural response, when we either fight or flight, that's something that naturally comes to us. So we're going to have an emotional and a biological response. But how do we reorganize our brain instead of having that first response to a thinking response? So the concepts not only addresses those emotional and biological responses, but the organization of the brain and how the brain reacts, or how we can change the way we think when we're having those events. And about investing in the development of self-regulation skills. That is something that even if we feel like we had mild trauma in our lives, that we can all benefit from developing self-regulation skills, and an opportunity to move people out of a reactive mode to more of a thinking mode. And one of the most profound insights that we gathered from Dr. Bruce Perry is the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. Now, think about that. Relationships. We're always talking about relationships, relationships, relationships. But we also need to think about it is not the quantity of the relationship, but the quality of the relationship that helps teaches us how to self-regulate, to think, and to respond in a way that we can receive the desired outcomes.
So how did we do this? Well, we provided a whole formatting to guide people towards what we were going to having a successful reflection as they were reading. So first of all, like has been mentioned, we provided kind of a trigger warning because there are a lot of stories in this book. That's one of the great things about it. There's a lot of stories, and it puts a lot of the higher neurological science terms in and I think Oprah did that in the conversational aspect of the book. But the stories can be triggering, so it's good to warn people before they read so they know that, because sometimes reading something or thinking about something can reignite that trauma. So if you're doing a book study on one of these subjects, it's always good to have that note there. So we divided this book study in 3 parts, and for each of our sessions, we had reflection questions. So we were not requiring people to write down anything, because a lot of these things, like Misha said, are personal, right? And then we had some optional assignments on Google Docs where they could put some things down before the book study. So let me read you a couple of the reflection questions that we have. This was for the second book club, which is book study, chapters 4 to 6. So one would be, we talked a little bit about ACEs, very overview challenge, but one of the things that we ask is reflect on adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, you might have experienced, and any worries that your ACE score brings up. Do you believe those experiences impact how you relate to others? That was for chapter 4. Chapter 5 asks, have you observed a relationship between trauma and physical health play out in your work? If so, how? Because we are exposed to trauma all the time in the work that we do. So it makes you reflect on that as well. A question for number 6, like I said, some triggering subjects. So is self-harm a problem in your encounters with migratory youth and families? How did the discussion between Oprah and Dr. Perry change or affirm how you view self-harm, et cetera, et cetera? So we had these, because this is the kind of book you want to read and then maybe go back and unpack. So that's why we thought it was important to have those reflection questions up front. So how did we structure this ourselves? Well, I gave the great idea to Tracy, and of course, she ran with it. And she had been thinking about it too, and she had just read the book. So she said, why don't we give this to all the TST, the technical support team? What we did to introduce it is we had a session during that meeting. I believe it was the Asheville meeting. And Laura gave a good background of the book and the kind of things, and we announced the book study there. So in that, what I showed you before, it gives a whole overview of the study, that sheet that we provided, And on there, we had those reflection questions. Now, an important part of this was when you meet, you have to have some discussion questions as well to kind of, if you have participated in any kind of book club, those questions keep you in track, right? So in a book study, it's the same way. You can kind of guide the discussion. And of course, allow them to share, because that's the most important thing. So I have some examples of discussion questions. The way we did it was that we met as a group before, and we met before to talk through like who would take each chapter's question and kind of guide that discussion. So we had a good group approach, 4 or 5 people doing the actual study with us. So some examples of discussion questions, same chapters 4 to 6. Trauma creates change you don't choose. Healing creates change you do choose. How can you support families in addressing and processing trauma or hurt as it happens? Another one, you probably saw in that slide that Misha was going through the regulate, relationship, reason. So first you have to regulate, then you have to fix that relationship, and then talk about the actual behavior, right? So in this one is why regulate, relationship, reason model, especially important when working with traumatized children and adults. So then, in addition to the chapter discussion questions, we also have some food for thought questions. So chapter 6 deal with some neglect examples. So we thought at the end we would do, what is your definition of neglect? The parent has to work so much to cover expenses. Are they being neglectful to their children? Or parents who have to leave a child behind in the country of origin for the child's well-being to send money home? When dealing with migrant families was viewed as neglect by many in the mainstream culture, it's a necessity born of love for the child in another culture. So something for you to think about as well. So that would be a really good, rich discussion right there. So when you do your own book study, you want to think about who your audience is. We found that having a smaller group is usually gives more people time to participate. Also, you have to think who is in your group, and how much pre-work you might have to do, how much post-work you might have to do, and think about the end. Why are you doing it? That's the first thing you should ask yourself. Why are you doing it? And like Becca said, this has several ways that can be a really good way to increase your professional growth, right? So make sure that that is clear to them, because I think sometimes we think of reading a book as not work. We usually relate it to a pleasurable activity, right? So I think making the connection that it's okay to take time to read during your work day, right? And incorporating that, but sometimes we have that. I enjoy reading. But I never thought of reading at work for work stuff, right? But when we had a book study in impact as well, and I really enjoyed reading. It was during COVID, right? So I really enjoyed taking a few minutes from the computer and just reading a little bit. So it's just wonderful, all the things you can do. So think about your audience and think about the end result. So we decided to make it a collaborative work, and I think it worked really well for us. One of the things was And I think for those reasons I just stated, and also scheduling during the day, it was a little harder to get people to Zoom. We had really small groups when we did in Zoom, so that's why the third part we did in person. And I think sometimes people feel like they can't participate if they haven't read the whole book, and we try to encourage people to say, hey, just read chapters 4 to 6 for this one, and you'll still get something out of it. So keeping that message of openness is always good. So there are a lot of things that you can do. Some ideas for collaboration with others. Also, if you have to do it over Zoom, or there are some instruments that can be used, such as Jamboard or Mentimeter, to provide some audience interaction. You can do some word clouds. You can have people post stickies, things like that. And like we said, there was those opportunities for people to collaborate and put their thoughts on that Google Doc. So you can actually take that also to your meeting and start with that, right? Like what really struck you? What are some quotes that really spoke to you? So what is the end result, right? So we did this book study. Sometimes the best professional development is ongoing, so maybe go back and revisit after you do it. So and then when you have that in mind, not only the end result, but how are you going to keep this in momentum, right? Are you going to create a book study maybe with another book? Are you going to tell people, hey, reserve this time? Are you going to do it over lunch for those who are really interested? I don't think you would get a good result if you mandate people to go. And also knowing, the size of the group you want. And like we said, we had to move from Zoom to in person. Everybody had the book to begin with. So sometimes you have to be able to be nimble and flexible in case things don't go the way you go. Those questions and discussions that we prepared for, I think we actually had one person come that time after all that preparation. That might happen, but I think doing it as a group and kind of going back and rereading the book, thinking about those discussions was really fulfilling to me and all of our group members as well.
Like Sandra said, a lot of times when you bring a book study to the group, people look at it as additional work. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is some additional thing I have to do. I just don't have the time for it. But that could be overcome by providing a choice. Gather recommendations. I know when they initially gave me the book, I was like, oh my goodness, I have all this work to do. How am I going to fit this in to what I'm doing currently? Well, after I read a couple of pages, I was like, oh, this is an easy read. So even something as if you don't get so caught up in all of the jargon of what you're reading, but something that seems easy, something that doesn't, and sometimes you have to think that doesn't require a lot of thinking. And that was why we included the reflection questions, the guided reading, because when you start off with your questions, you know what you're looking for. So when you help people to read or you kind of guide them, it doesn't seem like a task as much. And along with providing that choice, why not, get to know your faculty and staff, or getting to know your population? What are they interested in? We're more apt to read things that we're interested in, and we're more apt to complete things that we feel like we have a vested interest. And once again, once we we bring the book that we're talking about, if we can use that in our everyday professional terminology, or even in our everyday personal interactions. I know what I get out of the book, I start thinking about how my life and how I have responded to trauma and the healing process that it takes. And then I started thinking about the children that I have in my life. What can I do to teach them those self-regulating skills so that they too can begin to start thinking before reacting? So when you bring all these things into play, you start thinking about, okay, how can I not only become a more better person, but a better professional, and help everyone that I come into interaction with, or who I'm building those relationships with.
So in the chat, we're gonna tell you some of the books we're thinking about, but we also wanted to see if you can type in the chat, maybe some books that you're thinking about that might be trauma informed, or related to that personal growth, right? That you think could be used in a book study. So we'll give you about a minute to do that. And Laura, let us know. I don't see anything moving yet. If you have a book you think would be great. The books, the May book that Impact talked about. If you're doing, I mean, we did it for professionals here, but if you want to do it with teens or young adults, that book would be good. There's no words on it. But I think you probably could go page by page, and that's the book about the teenager that the parent asks him how they are, and they're like, meh, you know. Another book they're mentioning, they leave their kidneys in the field. Yes, very related to what Jessica was speaking about yesterday with the heat exhaustion. All right, let's give you a couple more seconds. Casa de Cartón, never heard of that one. But thank you, Consuelo.
Some of the books that we are, and I really like the suggestions or the recommendations that are in the chat. It makes me want to go and read more, because like I said, these books that we are considering and those that you are recommending are all about making sure that we become better professionals to the people we serve, as well as better people to our family and our friends as we continue to work on our personal relationships. But Mindset by Carol Dweck. Think about how there's a lot going on in the talk about mindset, and how the growth mindset versus, and I had this conversation with my child, and I was asking him certain questions, trying to figure out if he has a growth mindset, and how a growth mindset can kind of help you even in some of the more trying times. The happiness advantage, the 7 principles of positive psychological that fuel success and performance at work. How many of us, it's all about how we look at things at work, how we look at trying to turn lemons into lemonade, the way that we look at things. And once again, we're talking about not only the responses, but how we are thinking about our trauma, our circumstances, and how can we think so that we can self-regulate, that we can have a more desirable outcome. The Body Keeps the Score, talks about the effects of trauma on our bodies that we never really think about, how prolonged times of or prolonged events, how that changes us and how our bodies begin to show it. And anything by Brene Brown, The Gifts of Imperfection, Atlas of the Heart, and I see the circuit that Consuela says that is a tearjerker that we need to start thinking about. Like I said, that when we're doing these professional book studies, not only think about what is going to help us in our profession, but a lot of times when we're thinking about things, we go into it, what's in it for me? Yes, I can get this from a professional standpoint, but how can that or will that translate into my personal life so I can have long-term growth?
All righty. So in summary, the open, free-flowing nature of a good book study has the ability to increase trust, transparency, and opportunity to have fun among team members. There are tremendous opportunities to strengthen bonds among teams because we don't only learn something new from the book itself, but we're also learning about the people within our organizations. These book studies are an opportunity to foster strong, resilient cultures of relevance, knowledge, and teamwork. So now we're going to do a little bit of a call to action. How prepared do you feel to create your book study at your work site? And what additional support do you think you would need?
Yes, this is a great time for the chat. You know, just think about this and give us some feedback. You know, can you do this? We're happy to help you get started too. We're teachers, so we can wait. Any questions?
I have a question. Just in reflecting on everything you experienced through the book study, the questions that were asked, has anyone come back and said that it really changed their thinking? And if so, could you elaborate on that?
Misha,
me,
could you look this one?
I can say for me personally, it did change my thinking, not only as a professional, but as a person, how I think about things and how some trauma that probably happened when I was a teenager or even a child, how my brain has wired me to react to certain things that may seem to be a little unrealistic to the outside person. But because of the events that have happened, I now have to, I think about how can I change that? Because now my mind thinks that that is how I'm supposed to respond. So me personally, I felt like knowing this now that when I interact with those who I provide services with, I have to start thinking about, let's address the trauma. How can we self-regulate and change that thinking so that we can develop a pattern of behaviors that can rewire our brains?
Yeah, and I think one of the things of the book is that when you're working with young people, you don't want to just focus, oh, why are they behaving that way, right? You might want to, I mean, one thing that the book says is like, you don't have to go deep into the why, but what you can do, when you can change is your reaction to it, right? So instead of just saying, you know, stop this behavior, you kind of have like a calming moment, like, okay, let's refocus, let's see where we are, and then build that relationship, right? So you're building that relationship, and through rebuilding that relationship, you create that trust, and through that trust, then you can reason about what just happened. And I think it's very important for us as professionals to have those skills for ourselves in our personal life as parents, of course, and of course as providers for students as well.
Thank you. And if you want to look at the comment there from Kimberly, I like how you all say to think before reacting. For me, that self-regulating tool really helped me. I found that when I stopped to think before reacting, I realized that a lot of things really don't warrant a reaction or my anger and frustration. Exactly, good point.
Thank you,
then,
Kimberly.
yeah, there was another question, and I don't know if the person felt you had answered it thoroughly enough by having the books referenced earlier, but were there any other additional books you would recommend?
I think we have a good list going, but there's thousands of books. I'm an avid reader, and I have over 1,200 books that I want to read, and I don't think I'll get through all of them in my lifetime. So, I mean, any suggestions that you have, if you don't, if you're not thinking of them right now, or information is here, you can feel free to email any of us for those recommendations.
Thank you.
Laura, do you have anything to add?
The only things I would add would be to reinforce, someone asked about what books to recommend. I really personally like What Happened to You. I don't know if we kind of addressed it. It's an easy book to read. It's all written in conversation. So the conversation takes place between Oprah Winfrey, who's asking all of the questions, and Dr. Bruce Perry, who is giving his responses from the brain perspective. And so I think that, that's interesting and easy to go back to. And then I think what I always gather from book studies is how other people think, giving insights to me into what's important to them, what their values are, how they reacted to some of the information that comes through a discussion. It's an opportunity to listen, to get to know your colleagues a lot better, and to really be able to go off on a few paths that you wouldn't necessarily and normally pursue. I think it's a great way to gather ideas to, build that and I appreciate Colette's input into building connection and understanding between people. I have to, I'll just give a personal anecdote here that, the first time I read What Happened to You, and the book actually takes its title from, when people are dysregulated and they're struggling and their lives are filled with trauma, we often look at them and say, what's wrong with you? And What Happened to You takes you on the whole journey of looking at some of those same behaviors and issues and concerns in a new and different way. And so that's the background of what happened to you, what shaped your life, what shaped your outlook. So the first time I read it, I also went back to my family and talked about some things that we hadn't talked about as adults. We experienced or had many of the same experiences as children. But now as adults, we are able to look at and discuss, how we perceived different situations that happened to us and how we think that changed our lives in so many ways. So I think the insights, that book in particular gives me, the path to say, oh my goodness, things that I've never thought about in my life, and yet at the same time to look at them with, through a different lens. It's a good book. I think you would enjoy it.
Yes, if you watch any of the webinars with Mona Johnson, she's a big fan too. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, put it on your to-read list. Like I said, I read it and reread it, and they really put all those big brain terms, because of course none of us are brain neurosurgeons or neuroscientists, but it really puts a lot of those terms into understandable chunks. And like I said, it uses stories and things like that. I've read a couple of Brené Brown books. She's really good. If you have a chance, she has a website and you can go in and watch some videos. She has some great videos on certain things. So also another great pick. And Manderkolk, that really keeps the score. I haven't read it yet. It's on my to-read list, but if you ever get a chance to hear him speak, go for it. The amount of things that he knows about trauma and how, as a medical doctor, it really affects you, is really valuable for sure. We had something in the chat. Daring greatly, yep.
There any other questions? Anything else from the group? I want to thank the presenters. Wonderful job, and thank everyone else for attending. This recording will be available soon. So thanks, everyone.